Okay, so I'm sitting today with Franco Terrazzano again. They've been putting out a lot of great stuff lately. Well, and unfortunately, our government's been giving them a lot of stuff to work on. So you guys came out with a press release today detailing some of the management numbers from Alberta Health Services. Perhaps you could just start off and expand on that, Franco.
Well, for sure. Well, first, Cory, thanks so much for having me on. And we did put out a release today where we're diving into Alberta Government Sunshine List. And that's the list that discloses compensation for government employees that are making over $130,000 per year. So the big six-figure paychecks. And what we saw is we found more than 900 Alberta Health Service management bureaucrats on that list. So it turns out that the health minister, Tyler Shandro, is absolutely right to be looking at the top of the bureaucrat pyramid to be finding savings. And really, like, we're long past the days where Alberta taxpayers should be asked to be paying a big bureaucrat premium. Because if you look for the last 5 years, we've seen so many workers outside of government, right, struggle with pay cuts or job losses. And we haven't seen government employees share in the downturn. But right now, it's time to stop asking taxpayers to be doing all the heavy lifting. And it's time to start asking our government employees to also share in the burden and take a cut.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would seem if we're going to trim and we want to keep people working, then somebody has to give somewhere. We have to reduce the compensation a little bit, or we're going to have to reduce the number of jobs. So that's kind of the choice they're at. So I'm glad you guys pointed out that, you know, these people aren't going to hit financial hard times if they take a little off the top there with some of their compensation. So into some of the numbers, as your release said, there were some eye-popping compensation numbers in there, especially when compared to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, there really was some eye-popping numbers. I mean, first is that we found more than 900 management bureaucrats on the Sunshine List, right? So even there, that's eye-popping. But then when you look at the numbers, you're seeing that these management bureaucrats are making some big-time salaries. The average of those 900 was more than $193,000 every single year, right? That's their compensation, and that's the average. But when you look at the top, for example, the president and CEO of Alberta Health Services, she pulled in more than $600,000, and actually was closer to $700,000 in annual compensation last year. And that's about $200,000 more than her counterpart in Saskatchewan. When you look at the vice presidents in Alberta, they're making way more than their counterparts in Saskatchewan as well. So right now, taxpayers are being asked to pay for what we're calling the Alberta bureaucrat premium, but we can't afford it, right? We have the largest deficit in the province's history. We are face to face with $100 billion debt tab, and you can't keep asking taxpayers to give more of their hard-earned money. We can't afford it. So that really all points into one direction, and that one direction is that it's time for government employees, especially these top managers, to take pay cuts.
Yeah, well, and I understand that these managers are doing something. Sometimes how much they're doing might be in question. I remember somebody pointing out before, if you go to Foothills Hospital, Calgary, for example, any weekday, that staff parking lot is just packed from floor to ceiling. You go on a weekend in the evening and that parking lot's empty. Well, people didn't stop being sick during the weekend. They still need care. They still have some degree of staff on, yet 3/4 of them have vanished. But that kind of implies how much management is packed in there during the 9 to 5. Perhaps there's room to do that with a few less people as well, but the compensation numbers are certainly something to work on. So the UCP, as you said, the health minister, I guess in my view, are finally starting to talk about the hard realities that we need to get spending under control. And it looks like they've done a little bit of leading by example here with a recent move with their own staffing. What have you guys got to say about that initiative?
Yeah, well, we just heard that the United Conservatives, they're political staffers, so that they're going to be taking a 7% pay cut. And that's a good step. It really is, right? Kudos where kudos is due, because we've already seen the Premier take a 10% cut. We've seen MLAs take a 5% cut, and now their political staffers are taking a 7% cut. And so it is a good step. Now, there's still more work to be done, but they do deserve credit there for tightening their belt. And when I say there's more work to be done, I'm of course talking about broad pay cuts across government. You know, as I've already mentioned, like for the last 5 years have been devastating for so many families where workers are working outside of government, right? For example, our energy industry has been taking a beating, but it's not just the energy industry. It's the very many industries that of course rely on a healthy energy industry, like restaurants and things like that. So everyone outside of government really has been tightening their belts. We need to see government employees sharing the burden as well. And on that, we haven't seen a broad pay cut for the vast majority of government employees all the way back since 1994. So it's been a very long time. And the reason why the 7% pay cut to political staffers is so important is that it really helps give Premier Jason Kenney the moral authority to do what needs to be done to put our finances back on track.
Yeah, well, exactly. That was one of the first things Ralph Klein did before your time out there, but I remember it quite well, was they cut their own compensation, their gold-plated pension, and a number of things before they started cutting on the civil service. You have to, because you just look terrible if you're sitting there taking a full compensation from before, yet you're telling others to tighten their belts. A lot of people are pretty nervous with that, though. They see this as a precursor to some big rollbacks. What do you have to say with the labor element, who is already, it's funny, they aren't applauding the staffers taking a pay cut. They're reacting quite adversely to this, because I think perhaps they see what may be coming.
Well, I would say we need to see it, right? We need to see pay cuts. And back in the early 90s, Premier Klein, he went to the union bosses and said, look, you can take pay cuts or you can take job losses. And, at the time, they agreed to across-the-board pay cuts. And, that's almost the exact same type of thing that Kenney's going to have to bring forward. Are you willing to share in the tough times and take salary cuts first? Or does Kenney really have to lay down the hammer and lay people off? And look, not only do we need to reduce our labor costs, because our labor costs are making up more than half of the day-to-day spending, but we also should be reducing our labor costs, right? Because as labor costs increase, that means more taxes on the already struggling taxpayers. And it's just not fair to keep asking the struggling workers outside of government to keep paying the tab for our bloated bureaucracy. So not only do we need to see pay cuts and potentially job losses in the government sector, but we also should be seeing that as well.
Well, and there's room to make efficiencies without necessarily cutting, I guess, or even though it still leads to a radical change. A recent thing was the UCP talking about contracting out a great deal of health services, such as laundry, food preparation, and a number of other things, which actually I thought we'd done that battle before. It seems it all crept back into an in-house system again, but they're claiming it could lead to as much as $600 million in savings a year. And I mean, those jobs wouldn't necessarily all be gone. They're just moved on into the private sector rather than the public.
Well, you make a great point in that we can reduce government spending without necessarily reducing programs or services, right? If you look at the overall picture, Alberta spends $10 billion more per person than our other large provinces like BC, Ontario, and Quebec. So what does that show you? Well, that shows you right off the bat that Alberta is operating a very inefficient provincial government. Now, on to this move that we're hearing from the health minister, Shandro, about outsourcing, about going after management, and also just about attrition. I mean, these are the least harmful ways to find savings. And we really do have to find savings and be more efficient, especially in healthcare, because how we're spending in healthcare right now is just not sustainable. So, for example, we would save $3.6 billion every single year in healthcare spending alone if we spent like those other large provinces. And actually, Alberta spends the most per person in Canada outside of Newfoundland and Labrador on healthcare spending. So, I mean, really, any way you slice it, the Alberta government is very inefficient. And of course, we do have to be getting more bang from our taxpayers' bucks.
Yeah, well, and healthcare is the biggest spending item of them all, even though because people are the most fearful when it comes to those cuts, because they fear losing services. But as has been pointed out, we can maintain those services if we carefully rearrange how we're going to be doing it. So I imagine you guys will continue to hold their feet to the fire and be watching how these go. Your release and pointing out where they could find some fat to cut was well timed and well placed. I hope they're watching it, and I imagine you guys have got more to come for us all.
Oh, we've got a lot more to come, and of course, we're going to keep holding these politicians' feet to the fire. And Cory, thanks so much for having me on today.
Look forward to having you on again. It's always a good and informative chat. Thanks, Franco.